This is Deepening into Shadow. It's a fall 2019 webinar presented by myself, Jamie Wagoner, and Murphy Robinson. Murphy and I are the co-founders and the teachers of the Way of the Weaver program. So tonight we hope to give you a little taste of the types of things that we teach and what it's like to be in one of our magical circles. I'm going to start out with just a few housekeeping notes. If you're new to Zoom or you've never been on a webinar before, the first thing we want to do is during the portion where we're teaching, please mute your microphone. Even if you're being quiet, sometimes we can hear background noise of pets or typing or things like that. So please mute your microphone so that we don't have any interference. And you might notice that there is a chat box in Zoom. And especially if you're on a laptop, I'm not exactly sure how it works on a phone, but if you're on a laptop computer or a desktop computer, you can navigate to the bottom of your screen. There should be a little bubble that says chat. If you push that button, it should pop out a chat window as part of your meeting. And you can probably see in there, if you're looking at it, I've wrote a little note that says, "Welcome to our webinar." If you want to ask questions, that's a great place to do that as questions come up. Murphy and I probably will not answer your questions while we're speaking. We'll wait till the Q&A at the end, but that's a really good place for us to kind of keep track of questions or things people would like to share when we get to the Q&A portion of it. Let's see. Our recording of this webinar will be available in a few days, and you'll get a link that will tell you where to go so that you can view that and download it and share it if you like. Over to you, Murphy. Oh, do you want me to do the welcome? Yes, let me do the welcome.
Yes, why don't you do that first?
So I'd like to informally welcome all the members of the unseen world who are joining us tonight. That includes any land spirits, any helping ancestors, guides, gods, helping spirits of any sort. And I'm going to welcome and invite them in by lighting a candle right now. So members of the unseen world, we welcome you.
And we would like to also send honor and gratitude to the elders of the Abenaki people in Vermont and the elders of the Muskogee and Creek peoples in Alabama, which are the lands that we're teaching from. You can probably tell from how we're dressed which of us is in Vermont and which of us is in Alabama. Very different temperature profiles right now. But we would like to ask you all to please take a moment wherever you are and send prayers of support and respect to the Indigenous peoples who offer us an inspiring legacy of survival and who still are around and are stewarding the land where you live in ways that you're probably not even aware of. So many thanks to those people whose land we're on. So I would like to start by introducing my co-teacher for this webinar, Jamie, and my partner in crime for other endeavors as well, which you'll hear more about at the end. So Jamie is a writer and a traveler and a teacher. Her areas of focus include mythology, folklore, esoteric herbalism, divination, metaphysics, and the arcane arts of the priestess, oracle, and ritualist. She has a lot of really amazing experience. She trained and taught as a priestess of the Sisterhood of Avalon for 13 years, very witchy number, and now leads independent workshops and rituals at annual gatherings such as Reclaiming Witch Camps, which is where I met her, and the Land Sea Sky Polytheist Conference Series. In addition to her public appearances, Jamie is also featured in the Red Tent documentary released in 2012 and the Goddess on Earth project, among others. Jamie's magical praxis is rooted in a balance of personal growth and transformation, with active service that aims to empower others through inclusion, education, and support. She's an ardent polytheist, bringing enchantments of the unseen world to all her projects and endeavors, and I'm thrilled to be teaching with her tonight.
Thank you so much, Murphy. I'd like to take a minute to introduce Murphy Robinson. Murphy is a woods person who teaches archery, ethical hunting, and survival skills at their wilderness school in Vermont, with a focus on making these skills welcoming and accessible to women, queer and trans people, and others who don't see themselves reflected in the dominant culture's narrative of wilderness skills. Murphy also teaches at Vermont Witch Camp and has been a priestess for nearly 2 decades. They have been influenced by Starhawk and the reclaiming tradition, Daniel Foer's work on modern animism, and the ancestral pagan traditions of Northern Europe. Murphy's magical path leans towards guardian work. They have a deep interest in grounding and protection of people and places, and cultivate a keen curiosity about how we can acknowledge and address our history of colonization in our magical practice. And I really admire Murphy and all the work that they do in the world to help heal some of the pain caused by our legacy of colonialization and other things. So I'm constantly learning from their efforts, and I'm really, really pleased to be presenting with them tonight.
Thanks, Jamie.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So I think I'm up first, and I'm going to dive a little bit into walking between the worlds, moving from conscious to unconscious and diving into shadow, because that's what we're here for tonight. So I want to start out with a quote, and if you've been around the magical or the pagan community, you might have heard this before. And this quote is from Dion Fortune. Magic is the art of changing consciousness according to will. So if you think about that, that really makes sense, because when you've performed a piece of magic and it has worked, your consciousness has shifted. The story that you knew before has now changed. It's now altered. It's now evolved. So to me, that's a really great definition, and it really speaks to what we're going to talk about with Jungian psychology, depth psychology, and the shadow. So just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to tell you what the difference is between consciousness and unconsciousness for the purposes of our discussion tonight. So consciousness is a state of awareness, being aware of an external object or even maybe something within yourself, like introspection. Consciousness is a part of the ordinary or everyday world. And the part of our whole self that lives in consciousness is called the ego. This is the self of which we are consciously aware. The unconscious mind, or sometimes we refer to it simply as the unconscious, consists of mental processes which occur automatically and are not available to introspection. So these things are going on and we don't really have recognition or acknowledgement that they're happening. So this might include background thought processes. It might include stored memories, dreams, interests that you don't know about, motivations that kind of lie below what you're normally aware of on a day-to-day basis. So the unconscious is really part of the extraordinary, the special or unseen world. So the part of your whole self that lives in the unconscious is your shadow. Your shadow is the self that you're not consciously aware of. But don't worry, everybody has this part of their personality. All of us have it. And the reason that we have it is because culture exerts a certain influence over us all. The process that we all go through, because we live most of us, in civilization, the process of enculturation creates a division between the ego and the shadow, okay? So some parts of our whole self, they're considered acceptable. These parts get integrated into our ego, part of our conscious worldview. Other parts of our whole self are refused. But the caveat here is that they don't disappear. These parts of ourselves get integrated into our shadow, into our unconscious, and we're not often aware of them. So one of the misconceptions people have about the shadow is that it's all negative traits and motivations, but this isn't really true. If you think about it, some of the pure gold of your unique personality gets relegated to your shadow because it doesn't fit the mold that's cast by the dominant culture. I know an example from my own life that definitely drives some of my shadow behaviors is the idea of being too much or too big. Maybe you can identify with holding parts of yourself back so that you're not too much for a certain group of people. I know that's definitely something that's happened to me. So again, that's an example of the gold that's in our shadow, right? Now, it might be difficult to draw skeletons out of the closet. That may or may not be easy, depending on the history and perhaps even the trauma related to things you relegated to shadow. But if you're going to mine and own the pure gold in your shadow, that can be even truly terrifying, more so, because that's big magic and that's a big risk. So with all of that as our foundation and our baseline, The question becomes, why do we do shadow work, right? So if it's risky, why should we engage in it? Well, to keep us running just day to day, our bodies do all sorts of things. They regulate temperature, they regulate acid-alkaline ratios, and so many other just really microfine physical and chemical processes. So just like the rest of our body, our psyche also aims for equilibrium. So that's why it doesn't really work to cast out the undesirable parts of ourselves. Instead, we kind of store and accumulate more and more shadow. And when our shadow gets to a tipping point, it's almost always projected. And that means it's neatly laid on something or someone else so that we don't have to take responsibility for it. Projection is easier than assimilation. So what about that? Well, of course, that's really super uncool. It's a very unmagical way to walk in the world. But all kidding aside, why should we avoid this projection thing? Projections can insulate, and I would even go so far as to say potentially harm us, because they act as this constantly thickening veil of illusion between our ego and the waking world, right? So, and also because keeping it under wraps uses up a tremendous amount of our personal energy. If we're willing to delve into our shadow side, we can uncover and release what no longer serves us, and we can reclaim that energy and transform it for higher purposes. We can begin to tease out those unique healing gifts that we might have suppressed and learn to employ them in beneficial ways. We mindfully up our game and reset our equilibrium bar so that we have more joy, more connection, and more resiliency because we've dealt with some of these issues. And finally, the last thing, above and beyond the personal level of why you'd want to work with shadow and the benefits that it could have for your immediate community and friends and family because you're no longer projecting things on others around you, the last point I want to make is that any repair of our fractured world really starts with individuals who have the courage and the insight to own their own shadows. There is nothing out there, out in the world, that will really help us if the internal projection mechanisms of humanity are operating in full force. And I'm sure if you think about it, you can think of examples from your communities, from the world at large, from news, all those things. You can think of examples where those projection mechanisms are in force. So how do we bring this back into balance, right? So once we've said, okay, this is something that we should work with, and we see the value of working with it. Well, this is a really big topic, and I really only have time tonight to give you a micro introduction to shadow praxis. So first and foremost, the timing of this webinar is magical timing. In the Northern Hemisphere, which is where I'm teaching from, our nights begin to lengthen at the autumnal equinox, which is September 23rd in 2019. That's Monday. So riding the natural energy of this half of the year until the sun comes back again at the vernal equinox in March, comes back into balance, this can really deepen and support shadow work. So this time of year is a really good time. Also, this time of the month is a really good time. We're actually in a waning moon right now, which is a really good time to do shadow work, as well as the new moon or the dark moon. And the next thing you want to do to try to bring in some acts of balance is to acknowledge and ritualize. So the psyche is actually unaware of the difference between an outer act and an inner act. That's why the symbolic languages of ceremony and ritual are really powerful ways to work shadow magic. So you can start, again, this is a micro introduction with some really simple suggestions. So start by identifying some part or parts of yourself that are lying hidden in shadow. This can be as simple as making a list of personality traits, values, trigger behaviors, or it can be as involved as engaging in meditation or spirit flight work to seek out and directly speak with your shadow, which is something we practice and get more into in the way of the Weaver program. Now, I also want to remind you, just gently, to start out with your training wheels on, okay? It can be tempting to go straight for the big stuff, like straight for the big trauma, the big motivations, the really icky feelings that tend to haunt us. but you might want to gentle yourself into it. That's just an invitation to be a little softer with yourself and realize that this is not going to be easy work, even though it's going to be very rewarding work. So the next thing you want to do after you identify some small part of the shadow that you want to work with is get creative in finding a way to express this part of your shadow that satisfies it but doesn't do any harm. So for example, you can draw it, you can sculpt it, you can dance it out, you can drum it out, you can sing, you can write a story about it. So creative acts are really good ways to express that, right? And then the next thing that you should do to ritualize it is to burn, bury, or release the offering with the intention to give your shadow a symbolic place to play out. And then finally, just repeat as necessary. So the other thing, other than the acknowledge and ritualize part of the practice, the other way that we can find some balance is we can cultivate some allies in mythology, folklore, and fairy tale. Because we are all the characters in all the stories ever told. We can engage with these things to explore our shadow. So I want you to consider just a minute. Think about some of your favorite stories, okay? Think about some of your favorite heroes and villains. So questions to ask yourself: what is it that you love and or hate about them? How are they different? And better yet, how are they similar? How might you be projecting your own shadow onto these characters and their motivations? And remember here, the shadow aspect of your whole self contains the gold too, right? So you're not only projecting shadow in your dislike for a villain or a difficult character, you're also projecting those hidden assets as hero worship, as an admiration that you put on heroes you love. So, like I said, our time together tonight is very short, but I have like a tiny list of suggestions from mythology if you're looking for a jumping off place for stories to read and heroes and villains to explore. So stories of underworld descents are always a really great place to start pulling out shadow aspects. Of course, we have Persephone and Hades, Inanna and Ereshkigal, Orpheus and Eurydice. There are lots and lots of stories of descents and resurfaces. We can start learning about the cunning ones from mythology. Characters like Hecate and Bive, which is one of the aspects of the Morrigan. We can look to ferocious misfits like the Gorgons, like the Erinyes or the Furies, or Akil-and-Deshvari. We can look toward devouring mothers, some of my favorites, Caradwyn or Kali. We can look at tricksters like Gwydion or Loki. So all of those are really good characters to start to cultivate relationships with. That's a great place to dive into shadow work. I would advise you to check into the mythology and folklore of your own ancestral lineage, as well as your cultural lineage, because we're impacted by both. I would also encourage you to read many different versions of the same story to broaden your perspective. And in Way of the Weaver, we go a step further. We learn about how to build and sustain personal relationships with these archetypes. But we'll go into, that's something we go into the program we really don't have time for tonight, but it really can enrich your magical practice. So the collective unconscious, you might have heard that term. It was coined by Carl Jung, and it refers to structures of the unconscious mind which are shared among beings of the same species. Now, according to Jung, the human collective unconscious, too, is populated by all these instincts and archetypes that we've been talking about. So there are universal symbols like the Great Mother, the Wise Man, the Tree of Life, the Tower, and the many, many more, including our friend, the Shadow. And I'm now going to turn this over to Murphy, who's going to talk a little bit further about our collective unconscious.
Thanks, Jamie. That was really rich. I really enjoyed hearing you break all of that down for us. So let's see, the collective unconscious. I've been doing a bunch of studying over the past year or so around trauma work and being trauma informed as a teacher and an organizer. And more as I learn about the modern science of trauma and how it affects our brains and our bodies, which is like a very blossoming field of scientific and medical study right now. More and more, I've been realizing that trauma work is basically the same as shadow work. It's the medicalization, a medical understanding of this practice that's been going on in spiritual practice for a really long time. And as I learn like the modern psychological techniques and somatic body techniques for interfacing with trauma, I often like, they seem a little bit vague, or it's just like a little hard for me to get my claws into them and to really like feel grounded in what's happening. And I feel like for me, the missing piece is the symbolic language of ritual. And when we can use ritual and magical practice and myth and story to like bring concrete symbols into our practice of addressing our shadow or our trauma or our cultural trauma or cultural shadow, it just really deepens the work for me. And I think that our ancestors have passed down to us kind of the keys for unlocking this work that we need to do to heal our culture. So I just wanted to say that up front as something that I'm excited about and really enjoying putting together. So I want to talk a little bit about decolonization and anti-racism work as shadow work. So often shadow can become an aspect of a specific ancestral line or of a whole society's culture. And here on Turtle Island, which is one of the native names for what we often call North America, our society's resistance to addressing the wrongs of colonization and of racism are a part of our collective shadow. And as Jamie talked about, like our shadows can be like very strongly defended parts of ourselves. And on a national level right now, we're seeing our culture play out its defenses to addressing these issues, which are just like clearly it's time to address them. So many times we find that the shadow aspects of ourselves are based in an unmet need, you know, whether that's something in our childhood that we didn't get, or something that, you know, we weren't given by people that we trusted and were asking to meet us and help us meet one of our needs. So learning about the history of the economic exploitation and the suppression of land-based spirituality and the oppression of women that all happened in Europe before North America was colonized by European people can really help us understand the European ancestors who came here and like repeated this harm towards others. That's the whole thing about someone who was bullied often becomes a bully when they meet someone weaker than them, or have some unfair advantage over someone, which is more the case in the colonization story. And so understanding what these, you know, violences that were done between white people in Europe before they came over here and started doing violence to people with darker skin is really helpful in understanding how all this trauma is playing out still in our society. And the book Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici is a really deep investigation into the roots of these patterns in Europe. It is kind of a thick read. It's very, very academic and refers to all of these like Marxist economic concepts. It can take a little while to get through it, but it's very rich. And a more readable and accessible version of that history is related in the book My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, if I'm pronouncing that right, who is an African-American somatic therapist in Minneapolis who's written a book on trauma as the cause of racism in America and how to heal it through healing our bodies and our trauma responses. So those are both ways to educate ourselves about the history of where this shadow was born, where all of these things were first thrust into shadow for our culture. And knowing where that came from, for me, has helped me kind of get out of the paralysis of guilt. You know, I think as a white person living on Turtle Island in North America here, when you first understand and become aware of the full impact of colonization and racism in this country, which like I as a white person didn't have to become aware of just as part of growing up, I chose to cultivate that awareness later. When you first become aware of that, it can bring up all of this guilt, which is part of our shadow. And understanding the roots of that in our culture, for me, has really helped me move beyond guilt and into action and free up a lot of energy. So it's really important to process our grief and anger at the legacy of injustice that our ancestors have left us. In my case, my ancestors were mostly the perpetrators of that injustice rather than the receivers of that injustice. But I have a great deal of grief that that's like my legacy. It's really, really sad. And it's really important for us to process that as a part of our shadow work and let go of it. And Jamie listed some really beautiful ritual ways that we can express things in dance and song and let go of things, give them back to the earth to help process that grief. And we can really be the generation, we can choose to be the generation who metabolizes the shadow and pivots towards work for social justice. I mean, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. Many people have been working very hard on this and putting their bodies and hearts on the line for a very long time. But there's a lot of momentum right now for like a really big cultural pivot. And if we let our grief paralyze us, it stays in shadow. But if we let it fuel active work for change, then we transform it and we bring forth that gold that Jamie was talking about, that true power that has the power to change things. Thanks, Jamie, for posting those book titles in the chat. So if people want to look that up later, they can. So I want to talk about how work for change and work to overcome this cultural shadow is both inner and outer and ancestral work. And in the Way of the Weaver training that Jamie and I have created, we have this concept of the different levels of service that a weaver, which is similar to a priestess, or a witch, someone who really walks in the world with a certain conscious command of the magical energies around them and how they're putting them to use instead of doing it unconsciously, as many of us do, consciously weaving that work. So a weaver can be in service to the development of their self. And this is not selfish. This is very important that we work on ourselves and make ourselves stronger and work on our shadows. And we can also be in service to community, which is also very important. And we can be in service to that which is greater, such as the gods and the spirits and the unseen ones that we're called to work with. So this work for change kind of aligns along those categories as well. So the inner work is like part of being in service to yourself. So we've all grown up within systemic racism. And the work of unlearning the racist messaging of our culture is a lifelong endeavor, really for everybody of every skin color, because we're just inundated with these messages and we have to unlearn the ones that are unhealthy. And for people who have white privilege, such as myself, this can include active self-education about all of the common microaggressions that happen in our society towards people of color and how we can act as allies to interrupt them and step into that work for change and sort of run interference with other white people, which is definitely our responsibility to do. It can also include learning to be more skillful and intentional with our language, and learning, such as learning the indigenous names of the people and the places where we are, and being able to tell those stories. And listening intently also to what indigenous people and people of color are telling us about the impact that we're having on those around us. I spent 6 weeks out at Standing Rock supporting the indigenous water protectors there in 2016 and 2017 in the deep winter. And one of the deepest lessons that I learned there was the practice of accepting feedback with gratitude. And that was a majority indigenous community. And I was living at Two-Spirit Camp, which was about half indigenous and half non-indigenous folks. Sort of the queer and trans space at Standing Rock. And I was involved in the orientations for newcomers and in sort of teaching people how to step into that space gracefully, especially people who were not of Lakota descent. And one of the principles that the elders of that camp and of that movement asked us to tell every single new person, especially the non-indigenous people and the white people, was that if an indigenous person corrects you and asks you to do something differently or to say something differently, the proper response is thank you so much. Because usually, you know, we're sort of trained in this culture of white fragility, and people tend to be like, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way. That wasn't my intention. You're being very picky about the wording, or, you know, get defensive. And I see this happening all the time. And it sort of takes up a lot of energy, and you're kind of like asking the person who gave you feedback to like tend you, and it's just very backwards way to respond, because actually that Native person giving you feedback is extending a certain amount of trust to you that you're worth giving feedback to, because it is emotional labor for them to give you feedback. And if they're giving you feedback, it means that they think you might actually listen to them. There's a chance that you might do that. And it's actually a beautiful gift, because they're telling you how to walk in their culture and how to be a better guest, so that you can be, have less of a negative impact and also be able to be connected enough to be helpful in the movement. So I really learned a lot about when people come to me and say, like, Murphy, that phrase you use actually has racist roots. Did you know that? Can you stop using that phrase? My response these days is always, oh, thank you so much for telling me, not like, well, I didn't mean it that way, because it doesn't really matter how I meant it. It matters what the impact is. So that practice of accepting feedback with gratitude is a big part of inner work that a lot of us can learn to do. The outer work that we can do to balance this collective shadow we have in our culture is all of the work to stop injustice. This is the classical activism of fighting to stop ICE in your community, and working to stop unfair policing and violent policing, and to advocate for a stop to the family separation and all of the really appalling stuff that's going on the Mexican border right now in our names. And there are probably lots of groups in your local community working on different actions to balance these harms in our culture. So I encourage you to look that up and get involved as a part of working on our culture's collective shadow. And we can also work on a very local level in our workplaces, in our organizations, to fight discrimination that may be happening there, probably unconsciously, probably through lack of education, and to promote acts of reparation and truth-telling, and to promote a whole culture of inviting feedback and accepting it with gratitude. And then there's the layer of ancestral work, which can fall under the category of service to that which is greater than ourselves. Our ancestors are really part of, they're the mighty dead. They have a much bigger perspective than we have, and they have the power to support our work in ways that we here on the mortal plane can't do for ourselves. So our ancestors are really important. And our ancestors on all sides of historical wrongs had deep wounds associated with the trauma that they experienced or caused for others. Psychologists have really identified this condition of moral injury that gets lodged in people who have actually perpetrated harm against others and then witnessed that harm landing on them. And it's like a serious condition. It's a deep wounding, which is not to minimize the wounding of those who are receiving that harm and injustice, which is clearly like something that we need to honor deeply and correct. But it's important to understand that there's like wounding on all sides, and everybody is hurt by these harms. It's not just like one group is gaining and the other group is getting hurt, which is like a good motivating factor for white folks and settler colonist folks to work on this, because you're actually healing your own ancestors in this work as well. So working on the spiritual level to bring healing to your ancestral lines can make it much easier to do this healing work in our own times, and can recruit your ancestors as allies. And a lot of work on this has been done by Daniel Foer, and his book Ancestral Medicine is kind of the starting place and jumping off point for that work of learning how to reach back in time, really, really far back, to our bright and well ancestors, our ancestors who lived in a time before our society was so fractured and before we became so violent, and to enlist those well ancestors to assist us in bringing healing to all of the ancestors between us and them, and how that can bring healing into our own lives. So I encourage you to check out that work, or people doing similar work. And then the last thing I want to talk about is protection and warding. Because as the people around us wrestle with their shadows, some pretty chaotic energy can come our way, as we're all trying to figure these things out. So how do we protect ourselves from this shadow energy as we're pursuing our own healing work? Because you can get really derailed by someone else's like shadow flailing as you're trying to do your own healing. So there's a few things that you might want to integrate into your life, especially in this season of deepening dark in our days and in our psyches a little bit. And I don't see dark as an unhealthy thing. I see dark as one half of the whole. Dark and light are both totally necessary. But these practices can help us navigate that transition. So the first is cleansing, really regular cleansing of your energy field. This is a really good thing to do on a daily basis, maybe a part of a daily spiritual practice, which is something that we all co-create and design our own daily spiritual practices in the Way of the Weaver program, and offer community support and reinforcement for that, because it's hard to just motivate yourself on your own. Sometimes I've found that. But some different practices you could incorporate for yourself include just visualizations of clearing out our energy centers, whatever way of visualizing your energy centers works for you. There's the chakras, which is sort of an Eastern derived system. There's the 3 cauldrons of energy, which is like the Celtic framework. Many different cultures have identified this phenomenon of like energy centers in the body. So wherever feels right to you, you can visualize clearing out that energy every single day. And you can also really tend your aura, which is the energy field that extends out from your body. And this is something that's really fun to do with friends, if you have some like witchy friends that are willing to get up to this with you. So a wonderful practice is to do sort of like mutual aura grooming, where you can go up to your friend and who's asked you to do this work, and use your hands to just like comb through their aura. This is all happening like a foot away from their body, and to just like comb through it and pick out any tangles. Exactly, Jamie's miming it. And to like fluff up their aura and leave it all groomed and nice, and then they can do the same for you. It's a really nice practice to exchange with a buddy. And you can also do it for yourself from the inside, but it's just nice to take care of each other. That's part of our healing work, is realizing we don't have to do it all alone. And then there's also cleansing baths you can take with or without like specific herbs in the bath to bring forth a change in consciousness that you want, and a cleansing effect. And I'm also really fond of jumping in the wild waters when you have a chance. This is maybe a little more accessible in the summer than in the winter. But I'm lucky to have a beautiful creek on my land that I jump in most days in warm weather, and to visit many wild lakes and things. And there's something about jumping in that wild, sort of undomesticated water that can be really, really cleansing. And you can get back to some of your own wild and free and liberated energy through that practice. So another practice is personal shielding. So before we even talk about shielding, we want to talk about making sure that you're filling your own cup. Make sure that you're rested and nourished, hydrated and loved. And when we're well resourced in all of these ways, then we don't take on other people's negative energy as easily. There's not really like a place for it to lodge as much. So just being well resourced and taking good care of your physical body can, and your emotional body too, can help with personal shielding. But there's also energetic shields that you can create through visualization, and you can customize these to the situation. You might just walk around with a clear shield, like a bubble that someone blows from a bubble mixture, that just people can see through either way, but it just sort of, the negative energy slides off the outside and the good energy comes in. Or you can visualize, if you feel like you're in a slightly more threatening situation, you can visualize a one-way mirror around you as a shield, where you can see out, but other people can't really see in. It's sort of like cloaking yourself, so you don't draw as much attention, if that's what feels safer in that moment. And if you are feeling threatened, or like you need to really put up some defenses, you can picture a shield around you that's a little more spiky. You could picture a shield that has thorny brambles, or like rose vines with those big thorns on them, that will keep people away if they want to come and mess with you. Or some people might visualize something like razor wire. All those others of us would have probably traumatic associations with that from various like activism and interaction with the more prison industrial complex types parts of our culture. But whatever works for you that's like sharp and defensive. I like the brambles because it's natural and it's like the power of nature. So those are different shields you can visualize for yourself. And it can also really be helpful to carry a protective talisman with you, like a stone that really, has been charged up with energy for protection in a ritual way, or maybe is marked with a protective rune, or a little bundle of herbs that are protective as well. So anything like that can kind of help ground you, and when you're trying to remember to shield yourself. And the other thing you can do is you can ward your spaces. So marking the perimeter of your space, whether this is your home or your workplace or wherever you spend a lot of time, You can mark the perimeter just with energy, like you can walk through and really put down some clear, bright energy to sort of protect that space with intentions for warding. You can also mark it with ash or salt or a mixture of herbs that's meant for that purpose. There's all kinds of traditional substances that are used to ward your space. Another traditional one from the British Isles is rowan berries. So rowan berries the rowan is a tree that's sacred to the fairies in the British tradition. And the berries are considered very protective. There's these beautiful red clusters of berries. And you can hang a cluster of the berries over your doorway as a protective thing. I have a cluster of rowan berries over my doorway right now. Well, actually, they're mountain ash berries, but in North America, the close relative of the rowan is the mountain ash, and it grows wild in these mountains here in Vermont. So I picked some locally. And you can also use protective runes to ward your space. I've studied the runes a fair bit, and they work with both their divinatory and their protective properties. And there's various runes that can be used to create a protective fence around your space. You can scribe them in the air, or even like draw them on a piece of paper and like tack them up around your space, or anything you want to do. But I found those to be really effective, especially against like spiritual invasions. Or like I used this for my room one time when I was living in a haunted house, and it made my room feel incredibly safe and cozy and lovely, and I didn't have to worry about the hauntedness except when I left my room, because you need to leave some room for the ghosts too sometimes. It wasn't my house, so I didn't clear the whole thing out. So finally, if you let's see, so more of all of this will be covered in the first weekend of the Way of the Weaver program that we're going to tell you a little bit about in a moment. But first, Jamie has a few more things to tell us.
Thanks, Murphy. That was super awesome. I just want to wrap up our discussion by reminding you, kind of taking it back full circle, recognize that shadow work and shadow magic is really deep, nuanced work. So before you begin, check in with yourself to see if you're in a stable place mentally and emotionally. Being self-aware is really important, and especially if your intent is to work with a piece of your shadow or even the collective shadow that has been touched by trauma. So, after you've taken some time to consider that, next, consider a periodic check-in with a trusted buddy. Whether you're pursuing shadow work for you or for the community, you don't want to feel alone in your process. So have a check-in buddy. And finally, I just want to also state that if you ever start to feel overwhelmed, don't hesitate to seek the support of professionally trained counselors and therapists. It can be difficult work. And, I find that because of our society's cultural legacy, our puritanical work ethic, it can be very tempting to give in to guilt, shame, etc. But I want to encourage you not to get lost in the muck. Once you've done some heavy shadow lifting, balance it out with rest, take a nice integrative nap, and also write yourself some joy protocols, some little tiny things that you can do to infuse joy into your life to balance out that shadow work. That's especially important. And the last thing I want to remind you of is the realization that the work will deepen with each cycle. As we work the cycles of the year, the cycles of our lives, we can kind of think of this as a 3D spiral, right? So the further you spiral up, the deeper you're going to spiral down, right? Each year, more and more, if you're doing your work. You're working on that shadow part of yourself, and you're working on that sovereign part of yourself, right? And as you ride these twists and turns of the spiral, you might find yourself revisiting the same topics again and again. But the benefit here, if you've done some shadow work, is you're going to have more awareness and more self-agency when you spiral into those areas again. And I started out with a quote from Dion Fortune, and I'd like to end with a quote as well. And this one's from Rumi, who is one of my absolute favorite mystic poets. And it goes like this: yesterday, I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. But today, I am wise, so I am changing myself. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. That's a beautiful quote to end with. So before we start our questions and answers, so stay tuned. You get a chance to answer or ask your question really soon. But I just want to give a really quick introduction to the Way of the Weaver program that we're offering, which starts at Samhain at the beginning of November this year. And this is a 9-month program of spiritual study, and it's something that Jamie and I felt the need for in our own lives. And we hope that others will resonate with our vision and come and join us, because I know I want to learn all the things that Jamie has to teach, and also all the things that the people who show up in the circle have to teach, because we're all, you know, we're all teachers, we're all very wise, and the program is going to be designed in such a way that it can draw forth all of our wisdom, and we can be teachers to each other. So we will be honing our basic spiritual skills, but also learning more advanced skills. This is going to go beyond like Witchcraft 101 kind of thing. And we're going to have a good scholarly foundation for all of the things that we teach. I really admire the depth to which Jamie like researches everything that she teaches. It's really cool. And we're also trying very hard to avoid cultural appropriation and to really look at where that has crept into common pagan practice and where we can shift and cease doing that harm that people from the cultures we're appropriating from have given us the feedback that it's harmful. So we're going to say thank you for that feedback and respond. Things that we will focus on could include trance work, creating ritual, devotion, aspecting, which is a form of like deity channeling, and also shadow work. All right, so we're going to open it up for questions and answers now. Jane is going to facilitate that.
Sure. Feel free, if you'd like to, at this portion of the evening, you can definitely unmute your microphone if you'd like to ask a question out loud, or you can type your question into the chat box, because I'll be keeping an eye over there to see if any questions pop up.
Yeah, hello, Franz here. First of all, it was really a magnificent presentation, what you did, and such a great overview about the work you're doing. My question is that going to be over the internet, or is that going to be at the physical place? So where is that taking place?
That is actually a great question, and someone asked that in the chat at the same time that you asked it out loud. So that was a lovely bit of synchronicity. So Way of the Weaver, we've designed it to meet 4 weekends in person. We have 4 intensive weekends, which are a Friday evening to Sunday afternoon weekend. Those are all held just outside of Montpelier, Vermont. And then we also have in-between sessions, and I believe, Murphy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there's 6 sessions that happen in between, and those sessions are online so that we can, and we'll be doing, you know, a lot of teaching there. And then of course, when we get together for the intensive weekends, we do the actual physical practice and the co-creation of rituals and things like that.
Yeah, I'll add that one of the ways one of the reasons we designed it that way is that we really value the depth of work that can happen in person. And some of the techniques that we're going to be teaching are advanced enough that you actually shouldn't be doing them alone. You need to be doing them with the support of a circle that can tend you. So it's really important to do the in-person work. And we also wanted to make it more accessible for people who might be coming from a little further away. So it wasn't like 10 in-person weekends. That seems like a lot for people to commit to if they're traveling. So we tried to strike this balance of having the time to do the in-person work, but also having time to build up our education and our preparedness through these online sessions as well in the time in between.
Are there any more questions? Don't be shy. Is this the first time you are presenting this? That's from Chris. Hi, Chris. I'm so glad you're with us tonight. I'm assuming that you're talking about Way of the Weaver and not necessarily this material that we went through in the webinar. Is that correct? Maybe you could just type that in the chat real quick. Yeah, okay. Yes, actually, this is the first time. Murphy and I have known each other for a number of years. We've attended different witch camps and festivals and things, and we've always kind of been great admirers of each other's work. And it really just started out of a conversation, like an informal conversation that we had wherein Murphy said, hey, you know, if I could get some folks together, would you come up for a weekend and teach some things? And I said, well, you know, there's a lot I'd like to learn from you too. And, you know, just that list of things that we would like to learn from one another got longer and longer. And we were like, we think there's something here. So out of that conversation, which started about this time last year, we developed Way of the Weaver. So this is indeed the inaugural circle, is the 2019-2020 circle. So we're really excited about it.
I will say too, the spots we have available are half filled at this point. So if you're thinking of joining us, don't delay. It may be filling up.
Yes, that is a good point. It starts at Samhain, which is basically the first weekend in November. It's right after Halloween. And that's our first intensive that we get together for. That's the kickoff. And we already have, like Murphy said, half the spots filled, which means we have 10 people. We're capping it at 20 because we want it to be a nice, like, intimate group where everybody has, you know, there's enough time for everybody to kind of get everything they need, ask questions, have their voice be in the circle, and we don't really want it to get too big. How do you feel about folks opting out of any activity if a person comes out that a person does not feel comfortable? Murphy, so there is a question that came through from Ornella. The question is, how do you feel about folks opting out of any activity if it comes up that a person does not feel comfortable?
Oh yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about the need for everyone to feel like ready and aligned for the different practices they engage in. And we also want to conduct this training in a really trauma-aware way and know that everyone has different history with some of the practices or stories that we might be trying to work with. So it's very supported for people to be very real with where they're at and whether they're ready for a practice or not. And we can help people with that assessment if they're not sure. So yeah, it's everything's optional.
Yeah. I would agree with everything that Murphy just said, and I would also encourage, if there are specific things that you're worried about or thinking about maybe that you'd like to ask us about, please do send us an email, send us a message, or get in touch with us, and we can answer any questions you might have that you want to ask privately. And I had another question. Oh, thank you. From Zootsax, who has posted a link in the chat where you can find more information about Indigenous people occupying different parts of the land. There's an interactive map link that has been posted in the chat. So thank you for doing that. That's really great.
Thanks, Zoot. That's awesome.
Yeah. And Linnea Morgan has asked, is there somewhere online that we can see an overview, price of this program, and sign up? Yes, there is. Actually, we have a page all about the program, including a breakdown of what topics are taught during the intensives and during the Saturday sessions. And that can be found on Murphy's website, which is Mountainsong Expeditions. And I'll post the link to it in the chat box, but it's mountainsongexpeditions.com/Way of the Weaver. And I'll post that link for you right now.
And there's a tab right on the website that says where you can navigate to Way of the Weaver if you don't want to take it all out. And I will say too that our program is sliding scale and income sensitive. And our general sliding scale runs between $1,500 and $2,000 for the 9-month-long training. So we're trying to keep it super accessible in terms of price. I think if you compare that to other similar programs, you'll see that it's like pretty affordable.
What else can we answer for you? Resources for shadow work. I would say Murphy may have some too. For personal shadow work, so I'm just moving. I have a few little stone friends who have been with me through the webinar. I'm just moving them off of my stack of books so that I can show this to you. This is a book that I like to use. Let me see. I don't think you can see the title. It's blurred out. Okay. The title is Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche. It's by Robert Johnson. I'll put the link. And in the chat there, so you can check that out. It's a very good book. He is a Jungian psychologist. The one caveat I want to put on that is I would say it's not the most queer-friendly book that I've read. It's pretty heteronormative in its languaging, so just be aware of that whenever you're reading it. The other book, and I will post a link, and I only have it on my Kindle, so I don't have a physical copy to show you, but there's a book called Descent to the Dark Goddess, and I will put a link in that as well. And so if you really want to get into those archetypes and some of the stories and work with shadow that way, that's a really good resource too. I'll post those links for you. Murphy, do you have any you'd like to add?
I'll add a few for the wider cultural work, which are not necessarily specifically framed around shadow work, but I think are super applicable if you want to be using this work to address some of our collective shadow. So one is called My Grandmother's Hands. I already mentioned it, by Resmaa Menakem. Right here, it's got beautiful art on the cover. The other one I don't have to hand right now, but in terms of decolonization work, I would recommend the book Sacred Instructions by Sherry Mitchell, who is a Penobscot woman and activist and lawyer and author and spiritual leader who does a lot of work in Maine, and has written a really beautiful work that addresses the trauma of colonization from the perspectives of all the different people involved.
Okay. Sorry, I'm flipping back. Oh, you're welcome, Linnea. Sorry, I was flipping back between typing in the links and looking at the chat. Are there any more questions that we can answer? Anything else that would you like to add, Murphy, while I'm just getting a few more of these links put in?
I think that pretty much closes up the topics that we've explored for the day, and I'm excited to hear people's questions about the training, and hope people can look that up if they're interested and read a little bit more about what we've written, see if it's for them. There is an application to fill out, so we want to know a decent amount about you and to make sure that you're a good match for the program and that this is the right thing for the work that you want to be doing in your life right now. And we also do an intake call with each person and talk with them one-on-one to answer any questions that you've got. But feel free to get in touch with us with any other questions you have or you think of. I think Jamie's email is sort of in the information for this webinar that you've got in your email. And there's also a contact form on the Mountainsong Expeditions website if you want to get in touch with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always we do have a Way of the Weaver Facebook page as well, which again, you can send a message through there. Murphy and I will check those messages. Well, I just want to, again, offer my thanks for everyone who attended today. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you giving some of your valuable evening relaxation time to us. I'm really excited. I hope that even if you're not interested in the longer Way of the Weaver program, that you'll maybe keep in touch, maybe follow us on Facebook or something like that, so we can still kind of keep up with you and what you're doing, and you can keep up with us. After the webinar is over, in about, I want to say probably, the next 3 to 5 days, a recording will be available, and you'll get an email with a link to the recording so you can watch it again and you could share it. And we do add everybody who attended to the webinar. We'd love to add you to our mailing list so you can know about all the cool things that Murphy and I are doing. And if that is not okay with you, please email me. I have typed my email into the chat. It is wagoner.jamie@gmail.com. That's WAGGONER.JAMIE@gmail.com. And just let me know that you don't want that email, and that would be absolutely fine with us. We want to make sure that we have your consent. And let's see. I think that wraps it up. Murphy, anything else from you?
No, that's good. We got that done in an hour, Jamie. That was very efficient.
Well, I would like to maybe just end by thanking all the unseen ones who attended our presence tonight and were with us while we learned about shadow and we learned about the type of magic that we can do with that. So I'd like to thank them and let them go with our gratitude and our blessing.
That's a B.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Be blessed, everyone.